The wood was a quiet place in the hours before the sun found the valley. Trees kept their counsel in a slow, patient hush. Dew made the fallen leaves glisten like coins no one would ever claim. Elise knew every foot of the path that led from her cottage to the ridge, the way the stones turned slick with moss, the place where the stream hummed against a fallen alder, the hollow where foxes sometimes left their scent. She had walked it so often that the forest felt less like wilderness and more like a room she could cross with her eyes closed. That morning, the forest offered something else, a small sound, barely more than a breath, and the soft rasp of cotton against skin. Elise paused, the basket in her hand, then set it on a stump and followed the noise deeper, toward a stand of oaks where sun pooled in cold, dappled circles. She found it before she saw him, a child's hand, pale and small, curled around a soiled sleeve. Then the man, slumped, his coat gone to mud, his hair matted with leaves, his face half hidden against the roots of the tree. Two infants lay against his chest, their fists clenched and bodies thin with exhaustion. He was neither the sort she saw at the market with clean collars, nor the beggar at the crossroads with his hat held out. He smelled of travel and of blood, faint, metallic, not violent in the way that sets the stomach to turning, but there all the same. One of the children, a baby girl, let out a wet, surprising cry, and the man woke, startled, as if surfacing from a long, difficult sleep. Elise's hands moved before she thought. She had been a child in these woods in worse weather than this. She had seen hunger and hard winters stitched together with stubborn courage. She put her basket down and crouched, so the infants would not flinch at a sudden, towering approach. "Easy," she said. Her voice was small in the clearing, but not as small as the man's need. He looked at her with eyes as tired as dawn. There was something in them that made her blink. They were not merely frightened, they were contrite. "Please," he said, the single word thin and urgent. "They need shelter," Elise finished. The way he said it did not ask for charity so much as a permission already assumed. He pushed himself to a seated position, wincing. Blood had soaked his hand and dried into the cuff of his sleeve. His thumb moved in a way that made Elise look at his fingers. The index knuckle was swollen, a notch of cloth tied around it like a poor little bandage. "What happened?" she asked. "Road," he swallowed. "Ambush. We were set upon. Carriages turned, men asking questions. I told them I was bound for the East markets. They wanted names. They wanted papers." He coughed once and then frowned, as if embarrassed at the sound. "I lost count of the blows." Elise did not ask what he had done to deserve it. The world was full of reasons a man could be beaten and still alive. It rarely helped to unspool them by the hour. She rose and took one of the babies, Claire, who was still warm enough to steam a little against her wrist, and tucked the other, Henry, into a crook of the man's other arm with the economy of someone who had handled infants since before she could read the seeds of her own life. The man let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. "We'll get you to the cottage," Elise said. Her voice had the authority of the woman who mended more than just cloth. She mended the small breaks of life. The name she offered him was simple. "You can come with me." He made a face as if he wanted to refuse, as if he believed he had no right to impose on any cottage. Then he tried to stand, and life betrayed him. His legs buckled, and Elise, without ceremony, supported him beneath the arm. He was heavy in a way that meant he had been used to being carried, and the weight of responsibility that sat under him was heavier still. At the cottage, the stove still held the cinder of last night's fire. Elise fed it with a handful of kindling, and the room swallowed the damp with a sudden hush of warmth. She peeled the twins' blankets, washed their hair in cool water, and hummed a tune that had no words but enough memory to steady the small ones. The man sat on the low stool by her table and let her move around him as if her presence had already been earned. They ate bread with thick slices of cheese, and the man, who introduced himself as Louis Martin with a voice that made the surname sound like a borrowed coin, took only a single bite before apologizing for his appetite. His hands trembled when he drank, but the tremble was less pain than fatigue. He spoke little of where he had come from, only that he was on his way to a town 2 days hence and that he did not wish to draw trouble to any door. He called the twins Henri and Claire because the children cried when he tried other names, and names, in the smallness of the cottage, felt safer when they matched the sound in a child's ear. Elise watched him while the afternoon did its work. She saw how his fingers, though clumsy, performed the small, delicate tasks of soothing a child, how he turned a head, how he wiped a damp brow with a careful corner of cloth. There was a tenderness in him that did not seek praise. It sat like a warmth beneath his ribs. It made Elise's chest pinch in a way she would not have expected. They slept. For a time, the world forgot to be dangerous. When Madame Fournier came the next afternoon, she walked as if she owned both the road and the right to call out what she believed wrong in other people's houses. Her skirts whispered at the hem in the way of a woman who considered material evidence of a life. Madame Fournier had, as Elise well knew, a sharp nose for other people's business and a soft heart for scandal. "You let strangers in," she announced before the gate closed behind her. Her eyes slid over the pair of infants and then rested on the man, assessing him, not quite approving. "You know what the patrols say these days. They will take notice of any poor soul who helps someone in trouble." "We mean no trouble," Elise said. She kept her hands busy with a mend, fingers threading a coarse needle through a shirt cuff. The cottage smelled of fresh bread and soap. "They were hurt. I couldn't leave them to the road." Madame Fournier sniffed, as if the smell were some poor apology for common sense. "There are reasons these things come to the road," she said. "Collectors look for men who run with rumors. Houses that harbor such men pay a price in trouble." The word hung between them like a coal. Elise had long learned to neither take Madame Fournier's judgments to heart nor to reject the small, practical truths they sometimes hid. The collector was not a story, but a person who came with lists and ledgers, who kept accounts and took what his office allowed. Sometimes his reasons were reasonable, sometimes they were neither. Either way, they were a force. "Will he be better?" Madame Fournier asked, softer now. She leaned forward. "That baby, so small." Her hand hovered, and then did not quite touch Claire's wispy hair. "Elise is good with a child," the man said before she could answer. Louis's voice was a little sharper now, a thread of worry woven into it. "They tire. The fever will leave them if they sleep." Madame Fournier left with a cluck of disapproving sympathy, the kind meant to remind Elise it was not only warmth that paid a hearth's debts, but caution as well. Elise set the bowl down to cool and watched the man listen to the forest. He would not say then where he had been. He would not say what had been demanded of him on the road. He kept his hands to himself, with an economy that felt like shame rather than secrecy. The days that followed unfolded like the small domestic rituals that form a life. Bread enough to soothe hunger, a patch in a sleeve where the weather would not take a child, a fire tended to until the ash made a light they could sit around with less urgency. The twins filled the room with noise in the way only children can. Their mouths were small and quick, their fists clumsy, and both found in Elise's lap a world that was not full of men with questions. She fed them rice porridge, and the man, Louis, took to tasks he could manage, fetching water, gathering dry moss for the cradle, sorting herbs. His hands, even when they did not know the rhythm of a peasant's labor, learned it with the humility of someone who had to. There was a strange steadiness in it, a willingness that warmed Elise in the same slow way her fire warmed pots. He asked questions sometimes, about seasons, about the markets, about how people made ends meet when winter came biting. And his curiosity was not of the idle kind that judges, but of a mind that wanted to understand. One dawn, as rain turned the yard a dull silver and the hearth sent up a gray plume that tasted of soot, Elise found him pressed against the far wall, staring at a seam of his coat. He had been trying to sew, his fingers clumsy with the unevenness of cuff and cloth, and he had stopped. "What's wrong?" she asked. He looked at her and then down at the hand that had paused. "Nothing," he said, but the word had the shape of a lie, only a stitch that will not take. She came and stood beside him, smelling of damp wool and the faint tang of iron from the small bandage tied at his thumb. "Let me," she said. Elise's hands moved with an ease that had the rhythm of a repeated song. When she bent the fabric and pushed the needle through, she saw it, folded into a pocket and slipped in with the same care you might fold a letter and tuck it into a Bible. A ring lay there, small and shut, gold dulled but not eaten by dirt. At its center a crest had been pressed, a lion and a tower, simple lines that made the skin on Elise's wrists prickle. Her fingers closed on it without thought. The metal was cool against her palm. The morning, which until then had been all rain and the regular clatter of teacups, stumbled. For a moment she thought it a simple bit of jewelry, perhaps a trinket lost by some passer-by. She had seen rings enough in her life to know that people wore them for many reasons: mementos, bets placed and lost, tokens of affection. But this one hummed with a weight that was not chastened by time. It fit her thumb like a memory too large for the place it had been kept. She did not say the words that might have leapt from other mouths. Instead, she held out the ring and watched the man's face change. Louis's mouth had gone thin. He had the look of someone who had mislaid a life and found it in a place where it did not belong. The look hovered for a moment between shame and incredulity. Then he took the ring as if the thing were a test and turned it in his hands until the crest caught the light. "Elise," he said very quietly. "You're wearing the crest of the Beaumonts," she finished. The name felt heavy in her mouth, coated with the rumor of markets and the thin high collars she had seen on the road. The Beaumonts were a family she had only known in the way villages know those who move in rooms they will never enter, as a distant weather, as the source of taxes and decrees that came down like frost. To have that name fold up like a paper bird and sit in her palm was a betrayal and a kind of miracle at once. He swallowed. He did not try to deny it. "Louis Beaumont," he said. The name tasted of something he had not said aloud in a long time. "They call me Louis." Elise felt the floor tip under the small, ordinary details of the cottage, the pothook, the stacked bowls, the way the twins slept with their mouths slack against the fabric of the quilt. She had not expected that the man she had warmed by her hearth might be one whose word could change rules. She had taken strangers before. She had hidden a runaway peddler's satchel beneath barley sacks once when the patrol had been cruel. But to shelter a Beaumont was a different thing. It carried the weight of an office, of chains not visible to the eye, but heavy because other people believed in them. If the patrol came, it would not only be for him, it would be for the cottage. A sudden, sour fear rose in her chest, the kind that was arms against a door. "Why didn't you say?" she demanded, not loud, but as if the question could be used as a hinge. He let out a breath that trembled. "I asked only to be left alone," he said. "For a while." His fingers tightened on the ring, and for the first time Elise saw a hint of the man he had been forced to be. A life spent standing in rooms that smelled of wood oil and paper. "I thought if I said who I was, you'd be in danger. People see what they expect to see." "You—" The sentence broke in Elise's tongue. She had the right to anger, she thought, for she had not considered that harboring a man might bring a spear through her that was not even his. She had sheltered him because he was human. She had not bargained for the concept of princes on her table. He met her gaze with a plain plea. "I did not ask to be served. I asked only to hide." It would have been easy then for Elise to tell him the door was the door and be done with the rest. But when she looked at the two sleeping infants, the small, uncomprehending breathing of Claire, and the strong little fist of Henry, she felt the shape of a responsibility that had nothing to do with a name. The ring in her hand was a coin with two sides. On one side, a danger. On the other, the plain fact of a child needing a lap. "You should have been honest," she said, simply. "I should have," he answered. He cradled his head in both hands, as if leaning on them would steady something in him. "I have made mistakes. I know that. He stopped, breath leaving him in a slow exhalation that might have been apology or weariness. Outside, the way the road might be changed. The rumor of a seized coach had reached the market that morning, and the collector, Master Gervais, called the man with the ledger and the stark, efficient ways, was a name on every farmer's tongue. Master Gervais came with a band of men who did not quite enjoy their work, and who read from lists as if they were scripture. He was not a villain carved from hatred. He was a man who kept accounts, and who had children who needed bread. But that did not prevent his ledger from cutting into other people's lives. "You must go," Madame Fournier said, when she heard. She had come back with a face already populated by small disasters. "He will be taken if he is seen wrong." Louis shook his head. "I cannot go into town with these two," he said. "It would be worse than staying here." "Then you must be very careful," Madame Fournier said. "Neighbors do not always have the patience of saints." The day the collector came, the sky had the look of someone who was thinking of rain and deciding not to commit. Master Gervais towered at the gate in a coat that had seen better mornings, and a pair of boots that had hoped for less mud. He carried a packet of papers folded in his left hand, like a shield. He was plain-featured and wiry in a way that told of endurance more than joy. "Good morning," he said, though his voice had the clipped edge of someone who thought greetings should be efficient. He addressed Elise as if she were a field in a ledger. "My business takes me this way. I am making inquiries. There are reports of a man traveling with twins about these roads. I thought to ask if you have seen anyone." Elise felt the color rise in her cheeks. She answered carefully, because she had been instructed by life to do so. "A man passed the ridge, with children. He stopped to rest. He seemed hurt." Master Gervais's eyes flicked to the cottages, then to the hearth, then to the small sleeping forms in the cradle. "Do you know his name?" Louis, who had been sitting very still, looked up. His jaw was set. The quiet he had carried in with him resolved like a small, sharpened stone. "My name is Louis Martin," he said, and the syllables were simple armor. He did not add the crest. He did not offer the ring as proof. He said nothing spectacular. He said only what he thought might be safe. For a moment, Master Gervais regarded him with the impartiality of a man who recorded and catalogued human lives. Then he smiled in a way that was not unkind. "I see," he said. "If it is as the reports say, and if it is not, then perhaps no more than a passing curiosity. But if this man is wanted, he will be taken." There was no patience in the man's words for pity or nuance. He folded his papers, and when his gaze drifted to the babies, he softened, an almost invisible shift. "My eldest is the age of that one," he said so quietly Elise had to strain to hear. "She coughs in the night, and the leeches write that we need coins." He cleared his throat as if to put the memory away, and resumed the official pose. It was a small human moment, and it did not make the threat vanish. Instead, it made the danger complicated. Master Gervais had a ledger and a conscience that did not always speak, but it had people he loved behind it. His decisions were not wickedness so much as a balancing of burdens. Elise watched the man's hand, which trembled faintly as if a child's cough had traveled down his bones. "We'll not hide him," Elise said, the truth of it like a taste in her mouth. "But he will be safe while he is here. He was hurt upon the road." She did not tell Gervais that he must go, and in that she committed an act that would press like a thumb on a bruise. Master Gervais left with his papers folded and his mind apparently made. He walked with a man who asked no more questions than the road required. Yet the road carried news, it carried other men, and the small, cruel luck of those who read the names in books and believed them to be enough. That night, under a sky that had finally surrendered the threat of rain, Elise sat by the fire and watched Louis hold one of the twins. His fingers, which had earlier been clumsy with needle and thread, now moved with a steady, patient rhythm. The ring he had long kept hidden lay upon the table like a coin of another world, catching the lamplight in a way that made the wood grain blink. "You should go," she said at last, not angry, only practical. "Master Gervais does his duty. He will not be easy if he thinks you are evading him." He looked at her as if measuring what he might give her in return for such frankness. "I cannot take them to the town," he said. "I would draw more attention." "You could go to the tutor," Elise said. She had a name in mind, an old scholar who had once taught a nephew of Madame Fournier's and who now kept a house on the far side of the river, a place where learned men took to ink and books and did not ask too many questions of others. He keeps to his studies and will not like the sort of company that brings soldiers to his door. He might hide you for a time." Louis looked at the idea as if it were a small, bright thing. "My tutor?" he repeated. A shadow passed across his face, something like a remembrance. "He is old. He will not like the trouble." "Which is exactly why he would be useful," Elise said. "Old men are not fond of being fussed over by soldiers. And he owes a thing to the Beaumonts, or so I have heard in the market. He might keep his mouth shut for the price of a favor owed." He smiled then, a thin, grateful thing that did not make the room less sharp with fear. It made her chest ache because it was a rare and vulnerable thing in a life that had been too often public and hard. "Very well," he said. "If you will have me, we will go. We will go before the patrols think to come this way." He paused, and then added quietly, as though to test the air, "When you found us, did you know who I was?" "No," Elise said, and the truth sat between them with no apology. "If I had, I would have done the same. These are small people. They need a lap." He exhaled, a sound that might have been both relief and the surrender of something else. "Thank you," he said, "for not looking at me as the thing I stand for seeing me as a man." She shrugged. "It's 2 babies and a man who is hurt," she said. "I can count to that." Plans were hatched in a practical way. gather what would not be missed, fold what could be hidden in the baskets meant for market, leave before midday when attention was thin and carts took their own cumbersome time. The world had no patience for stories. The road would ask only to see bodies and names. But Elise had learned that some stories bent other people's edges into shape. When dawn came, it was a pale promise. The twins slept heavy, the kind of sleep that does not startle easily, not yet curious, not yet in possession of the world's cruelties. Elise packed bread into a bundle and wrapped Henry in a cloak, setting Claire against Louis's chest like a talisman. The ring lay in the pouch she had stowed against her own skin, because she could not bear for him to carry the thing that would change their lives if found. Madame Fournier watched them go from across the gate, her face composed as if to give them a last piece of disapproving grace. Master Gervais was not yet seen, and the road itself slept, only birds to mark the distance. Elise shut the gate quietly and took a step toward the uncertain. They would cross the river that day, and the country that came beyond it. They would walk under hedges that smelled of wild thyme, and past lanes where men mended carts. They would, for a while, be a small household moving like a drift of leaves carried by the wind. And somewhere, in a room that was carved of dark wood and lit by an oil lamp that coughed black smoke into a high ceiling, a child of a different sort, one schooled in the etiquette of rooms that did not smell of smoke, watched the road as if expecting trouble. Louis, who had been a prince in his own right and was now a man with 2 children and a boot full of straw, felt the ring against his palm and wondered whether everyone who carried a name could ever divest themselves of it. They set out while dawn still held clinging mists along the hedgerows. The world beyond the lane was noisier: carts, a boy with a stick, a woman calling for a lost hen. They walked as if their lives were folded in a parcel between them, and every stranger's face was a small possibility of being known. When they passed the crossroads, a cart halted, and a man leaned out, squinting at them. For a heartbeat, Elise thought they had been seen. Then the man tipped his chin and rolled his eyes and let them pass. They had a measure of luck, or perhaps just the grace of anonymity. But luck was a pale thing, and not to be trusted. She had, in her life, trained herself to expect the weight of what came after. Half a mile out, on the road that tilted toward the tutor's house and the river beyond, a sound fell behind them, like an echo, hoofbeats, careful and deliberate. They slowed as if the road itself had ordered them to. Then Louis tightened his grip on the twins. Elise's legs moved the way they always did when she thought of danger: forward, practical, steady. She kept her step even when the horses drew near and the road shifted its mood. The rider did not gallop. He rode with the calm of a man who had been given instructions to observe and not to inflame. He had no armor, only a cloak pulled close, and when he leaned down from the saddle, his eyes assessed them as if reading from a list. "Good day," he said. His voice carried the same efficiency as Master Gervais's, but softer. "My master sends greetings to those traveling. He is looking for a prince and his children. Have you seen such a man?" Elise's throat tightened. She looked at Louis and saw that his face had gone still, the color draining as if a curtain had slid over it. Claire fussed, and Henry let out a small, alarmed cry that sliced the air like a knife. "No," Elise said. Her voice did not waver, though her fingers had learned to lace and unlace in the defensiveness of habit. "We carry no such man." The rider's gaze lingered on the ring at her waist, not because he knew what it was, but because a ring has a way of drawing the eye to certain small truths. He shrugged and rode on, his horse's shoes making a steady, indifferent sound on the road. They watched the hoofprints fade, and for a moment a silence replaced the sound of the world. Elise felt her chest loosening and then tightening again. It would be a while before the tutor's house, a long while of fields and hedges and the chance of being seen. The hands that had once shaped treaties would live in the possibility of being caught. She felt the weight of the ring at her waist and wondered how easily a single piece of metal could alter a life. They walked on. The river was on the other side of a green slope, and beyond it a house with tall windows sat like a patient old thing. They did not speak much as the miles slid by. Their conversation had become the steady, practical kind that shared tasks instead of fears. For now, the forest was behind them, and the world ahead was open in its own ways, not without hazards, but navigable by the sort of small decisions Elise made every day: where to set the basket, when to mend a stitch, how to soothe a child's fever. The tutor's gate appeared at last like the promise of a harbor. A low stone arch, overgrown with ivy, and a man in a weathered coat who leaned on a cane and squinted at anyone approaching as if measuring their honesty. He was a small man with bright, intelligent eyes and a mouth that learned to bend into a smile when the world showed him something interesting. "Elise," the tutor said, not as a stranger, but as one who had expected the particular set of footsteps that came up the lane. "You have brought the road into my yard." He peered more closely at the twins in Louis's arms. Trouble grows restless in spring. "Nothing we can't handle," Elise replied. Her voice was steadier than it felt. She curtsied as if it were habit, though she rarely made formal gestures. "They need a place to rest. I have a favor to ask." The tutor considered them with an indulgent eye, and then, as if persuaded by something private, he stepped aside and invited them in. "Come then, you will find a bed perhaps too small, and bread perhaps too plain, but if shelter be the thing you require, there is room." They crossed the threshold into a house where books made the walls look as if they breathed, where maps had torn corners and teacups sat on saucers that had seen countless conversations. The tutor bustled about like a man who had begun to believe the world could be mended by attention to detail. He warmed rooms, offered a basin, and then sat Louis down in a chair that took him in like a good listener. Night settled into the house like an answered prayer. The twins slept in a shallow cradle near the fire. Louis sat, his hands void of useless habit, looking older than the day had any right to make him. Elise took the ring from where she had kept it, and for reasons she found only halfway admirable, she put it upon the table where it glinted like a small sun. "You may not know the weight of what you carry," the tutor said at last, watching the thing. He had the gentle bluntness of a man who had taught boys who would one day wear coats of office. "Names are like tools. They make people expect a shape. A man who carries the name of the Beaumonts will be seen differently. He will be hunted differently." Louis nodded. "I know that. I knew it before I left. It is why I did not tell you when you first sheltered us." Elise sat with her hands folded and felt the room spin a little less. For the first time since the ring had been found, she let herself imagine what it might mean to return to the world with this secret safe between them. She felt a strange mix of fear and something like possibility, that private, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, a life could be altered by the simplest kindness. Outside, the road wound on and the shadows pooled. The tutor moved to an open window and, for a moment, looked like a conspirator letting in light. He would keep his mouth shut, he said, for the price of a favor owed and the comfort of bed. Master Gervis would have to be told something else, a story that held no weight of the Beaumont mame. They had a night in which to breathe and a morning in which to decide. They would not be safe forever, but for the first time since she had found them under the oak, Elise allowed herself to believe that shelter could be more than a temporary reprieve. It might be the place where two strangers learned the measure of one another, of what they owed, of what they feared, and of how the small acts, mending a cuff, sharing bread, wiping a child's brow could change a man's life almost as surely as any book or decree. She slept with the sound of the river in her ears and the tiny, constant breathing of the twins named Di. Louis, whose name had the weight of a house around it, slept with his hand over his heart, as if to keep the ring safe. The tutor's house, with its books and its quiet, held them all like a hand cupped around something fragile. The morning would bring questions. It would bring the meeting with Master Gervis that would test the tutor's pledge. It would bring the slow, patient business of making a decision that would not be undone by luck alone. For now, in the dim before sunrise, Elise rose and stepped into the small garden behind the tutor's house. She stood for a long time with her fingers in the soil, feeling the damp and the cool, and thought of the forest and of the man she had warmed and of the ring that had set so many hands to worry. She had sheltered a stranger who cradled her children's future in his arms. She had no idea he was a prince when she first laid him on her table. That was the truth. And the truth, like a seed, would require something of those who tended it. Dawn unfurled slowly at the tutor's house, as if the morning had been given time to gather courage. Elise moved through the rooms with her hands full of small errands, sweeping the hearth, cradling a mug with tea that steamed like a private sky, checking the twins' cheeks for the faint heat of fever. The tutor dozed by the window with a half-read book abandoned on his lap. His features, relaxed in sleep, made him look younger than his years. Outside, the river chattered against stone as if to remind the world that movement was a thing you could count on, even when people were not. For all the hush, nothing felt settled. The ring, which she had set by the edge of the table, blinked as if it had its own small pulse. Elise kept catching her eye on it, the way one looks at a bruise that will not go away. Curious, wary, a little ashamed that such a single object could make ordinary things feel perilous. She was careful with its name, because names had power. Louis Beaumont meant a cluster of expectations neither of them had invited into the quiet of the tutor's kitchen. The tutor, whose name was Marius, moved with that odd, obliging energy elders keep for emergencies. He fussed over the twins with the deliberation of a man cataloging an unfamiliar species. He dissected their needs, sugar for a faint hunger, a poultice of boiled linseed for a rash, and handled pots and life with equal seriousness. He asked Louis about his travels, not with curiosity so much as to map what danger might follow them. Louis answered in small sentences that always seemed to begin and end at the same place, admission and regret. His eyes, when they met Elise's, carried that new embered steadiness she had seen under the oak, someone who had been exposed to a truth and found that it hurt less to live with it than to keep it hidden. He fetched water like a man who could be precise and gentle both. He wrapped Henri in a blanket while humming something that sounded like an old house song. Claire slept with a fist closed against his collar, as if owning the fabric could tether her. They fell into a rhythm that the tutor accepted with a dry smile. "You have the look of people convalescing who also think of leaving," Marius observed one afternoon, handing Louis a small volume of accounts as if it were a talisman. "Do you wish to be kept like eggs, or to be put on a road when you can stand?" "We must not be in his sight long," Louis said, fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. "Master Gervais is thorough." Marius rubbed at his chin with a strip of cloth. "Gervais takes the work of many men seriously. He is not wicked, merely firm. That makes him efficient. And when efficiency meets fear, it can be cruel. But he will listen if you speak plainly." Elise watched them. She had not been raised to slip into rooms of argument. She had been raised to make things hold together with thread and elbow grease. Yet, in the quiet study, she found herself listening in a new way, measuring words as if they were stitches that might either bind or tear. Louis's plan, when he finally made one, was as small and exact as a stitch. He would go to the city not as a prince cloaked in privilege, but as a man who had been on the road and had witnessed what collectors demanded. He would stand before his council not with the airs of someone asking for pardon, but with the voice of someone who had learned what suffering looked like up close. "You will come back?" Elise asked at night as they sat by a low fire, the twins finally quiet and each breath a tiny weather in the dark. Louis cupped his hand around Claire's head and looked at her as if trying to read the shape of her future. "I must," he said, "not to use a name, but to try to change what I can. If I do not, then what good is the power I was born into?" "That is not a small thing," Elise said. She thought of the ring on the table, of how it had altered the air between them. "What I worry about is not your intention. It is what people do with the meaning of your choice. Will they use you to hide their consciences? Will they make you a symbol and not a man?" He answered with that frankness she had come to know. "Then do not let them. Come with me, if you will, not as someone to be set on a cushion, but as someone who traveled with me and saw what came when men knocked on doors." The invitation sat between them like a hearth lid slightly ajar. Elise thought of the cottage, of the pothooks and the back step that had known her breath for years. She thought of Madame Fournier's frowns, of her neighbors who might gossip until the road itself felt hunched with rumor. The palace would be a place that asked for polish and measured movements, a place where every word had an audience. It was not the life she had planned. It was not a life she had desired, except that, underneath the weight of practical choices, there beat something else, a stubborn conviction that shelter had been the right thing to give, and that if shelter could mean more than a bed, perhaps it could mean change. "I am not much for halls," she said, feeling honest enough to name it. "I am good at knowing which loaf will burn and how to stitch a sleeve so it stays. I do not know how to stand when men watch." "You stand because you have stood before," Louis replied, and his voice folded a small, rueful humor into the room. "Besides, you will tell me when I speak poorly." She laughed then, a short sound that felt like a small, useful rain. "That I will." Word could not hold still in the countryside. It crept like ivy, tender at first, then more rooted. News reached them that Master Gervais had questioned more villages, that his men had been seen at a crossroads beyond which lay a market. The tutor read the posts and papers with a calm that was almost conspiratorial. "We must make a path for your voice," he said abruptly one evening, pushing a sheaf of papers toward Louis. "Not petitions or bravado, facts, accounts, stories that show what the collections do to families." Louis took the pages, flattening them with careful hands. There was a humility in his willingness to be taught that made Elise's chest ache. He spent mornings at the tutor's table poring over receipts and ledgers, learning the language of burden. He learned to read a tally not as a number, but as a measure of a household's breathing. How many loaves, how many stitches, how many nights a frugal lamp might burn. On other mornings, he practiced the measured cadence of a man used to speaking in rooms where one slip could be costly. Elise watched him practice pronouncing phrases that once had been only a distance in his mouth. Each repetition made him steadier. Between lessons, there were small domestic moments that seemed to bind their days together, Louis splitting kindling with the awkward competence of someone unused to an axe, his arm surprising him with a strength he had not known he possessed. Elise teaching him to mend a child's sleeve so that the hem would not fray with the first wash. the tutor offering wry commentary on the economy of porridge. The twins learned to finger the edge of his coat and to call him by the name he made simple and patient. Each of these acts, pouring, mending, lifting, slowly turned acquaintance into something like family. One night, when the wind pressed cold against the casement and the faint blow of lamplight made small islands on the walls, Louis asked Elise to sit with him in the study. He had the look of a man ready to put pieces in order. "Marius says the council will hear me if I go with a record of harm," he said. "He says they will listen if it is not only complaint, but proposition. But I am afraid, Elise, afraid of failing them." She braced her palms on the chair arms and leaned in. "You will fail at things," she said plainly. "We all do. The question is whether you keep to what's right after." He gave her a small, exhausted smile. "I will try, but I must ask for something else." He reached out, covering one of her hands with both of his fingers warm despite the night. "I have not thought of myself as needing to be saved before I met you. I thought my duty was a list of things done by others for me. I had the arrogance to believe that my name meant I had a right to make decisions about people I did not know. I have been blind." The admission landed between them in the kind of silence that pulls at the edges of a room. Elise searched his face. There was no pretense in the lines at his eyes, no gilding. "You have been given a shape to fill," she said slowly. "What matters is what you do with it now. That is all any of us have." He pressed his forehead against her knuckles, as if to read the map of a single steady human truth. "I love you, Elise," he said without flourish, the words arriving as if they had been rehearsed less for eloquence than for necessity. "If I am to step into rooms that will judge me, I want you to know that what I carry is not ambition alone." She felt a prick at the corner of her eye, annoying, raw, with something like warmth. It startled her that the rumor of love, which people fling like a coin, should reveal itself as so particular and heavy. This man, who had walked under oaks with 2 infants and told half-truths, now made a confession with the calm weight of sincerity. "You are asking a great deal," she said. "Not only your life changes, but the people who know you will take those changes and put them on display. I will not be a trophy, I will not be a token. If I go because I choose to, not because you or anyone else expects me to be a story." He nodded so earnestly it nearly bowled him over. "Then chins, Elise. Choose freely. I will do what I can to keep you as you are, not swallowed by trappings." She thought of the cottage, the crooked doorframe, the way the children's boots dried by the stove, the small crooked spoon she had used since her mother's time. She thought too of the tutor's maps, of the way a ledger could be turned into relief if someone had the courage to read it differently. There was no neatness in her decision. There was only the stubbornness she had learned from years of making what little she had last longer. "All right," she said at last, and her voice held the strange, complicated courage of someone who knows what they will lose and what they hope to gain. "For the children and for the people I cannot help from a distance, I will come." They prepared then with the slow efficiency of people who knew that farewells were a kind of work. The tutor supplied a cart and a driver who resembled a confidant more than servant. Marius tucked a stack of papers into a satchel so worn it looked like folios of common sense. The ring was tucked into a little cloth and placed where Louis could feel its weight without it needing to be shown. Elise packed a small trunk with things that smelled like home: a remnant of linen, a spoon of olive wood, a kerchief her mother once used to wind up the hair of sleeping infants. The journey to the city felt like crossing into another weather. The lanes narrowed and widened into paved streets that resisted mud with a kind of arrogance. The air grew thicker with smoke and voices. They passed inns whose signs swung like the gestures of strangers. They threaded through markets full of the business that sustains a realm, where bakers yelled the names of their loaves and women bargained like seasons. For Elise, who had known the map of the wood by heart, the city was a collage of new shapes. For Louis, it was the old stage he had once traveled with a boy's naivety and man's shame. They were met at the palace gates by servants who read Louis's face and showed him the economy owed to his name: hushed bows, practiced smiles, measured steps. Elise noticed how quickly the air around them changed. Footsteps softened to a different rhythm. Doors opened almost before they reached them, and the twins watched the ceiling as if it were a sky with touchable stars. The palace itself smelled of wax and old wood, the draperies muffled sound until the world felt like a room kept for secrets. The council chamber was long, with a vaulted ceiling and tapestries that had once been full of life. Stones absorbed sound so that even a cough seemed to demand justification. Louis stood before a bench of men who had the look of habit, ages of service wrapped in clothes of careful cut. Some wore the look of those who had been shielded by power. Others bore the thin creases of men who had known the climb of public life and the jumble of compromise. Elise sat not far from the door, her hands folded upon her lap, each movement more measured than the last. For all the pageantry, there was a democracy of tiredness in the faces, each man aware of the work of looking competent while being very human. Louis's speech was not theatrical. He spoke of the road, of the men who came with ledgers and asked for names, of the women who bartered bread for a sliver of quiet, of children who learned the dates of hardship like verses. He read aloud selections of the tutor's notes, a list of households nearly stripped by a season of collection, a ledger showing how the tax on salt had forced 2 farmers to sell a cow, the names of 2 sisters whose small stall had been shut because a clerk misread a margin. When he spoke of the twins, of the thin breath of Claire and the small stubborn fist of Henri, something shifted in the chamber. He did not brandish their innocence as proof of moral absolutism. He used them as an example, a human measurement of policies. He admitted his own error, that his family had been blind to the particulars of suffering. He told them, with a frankness that made some men blush and others straighten their papers, that he had been sheltered, too, by a world that named his comfort as inevitability. "You will not change the world with a single speech," Elise had told him once, and he had taken the line with gratitude. In the chamber, he did not promise sweeping laws. He proposed listening. He proposed a small commission to audit the methods of collection and to allow for appeals, places where people could make their case and be heard before coffers were emptied. He suggested that collectors be required to keep clear accounts, that overseers visit villages not only to demand but to tender grievance forms, that some relief be considered for households with new infants. He proposed the appointment of a small board to consider cases where children or illness merited temporary exemption. The men argued, as men do when asked to rearrange what they had long accepted. Some resisted, citing the need for order and revenue. Some asked questions about the precedent of easing collections. Louis listened without the old arrogance and answered not with condescension, but with examples culled from the tutor's papers. He asked not for applause, but for oversight. He asked for time and for patience. Then, when the room had warmed and the debate had reached the point where words circled like birds choosing a perch, Louis did something quieter and far braver than most speeches. He looked toward Elise, who was holding Claire now because the child had taken to his lap when unsettled, and he named her. "This woman," he said, voice steady and a touch raw, "taught me the measure of ordinary kindness. She took us in when we had nowhere to go. She is not an emblem. She is the person who showed me that children cannot be accounted for as statistics. I will not make her my symbol. I ask only that you see the work of care as something that bears weight in your decisions." A hush fell. Some looked astonished. Some looked appalled that personal life had entered the business of counsel. Yet the air shifted again, not with cowardice, but with a small, awkward respect. Louis went on, not to press Elise into a spotlight, but to anchor his reforms in the actual human cost of policy. It was not the spectacle some might have expected when he turned then to ask a question that had nothing strictly to do with commissions or ledgers. He rose from where he had stood and stepped toward Elise with a ring in his hand. It was the same ring she had found, but cleaned and bright, its crest catching the lamplight like a small sun. "Elise," he said, voice without script, "you chose to give shelter when it would have been simpler to look the other way. You taught me how to hold small things steady. I would ask you to be with me, not to change your mind or your mettle, but to be there as I try to be a better steward of what I've been given. Will you marry me?" The chamber, so used to numbers and precedent, paused. Elise felt everyone's gaze compress into a small pressure at her neck. It was not the theatrical proposal of romance told in ballads. It was a decisive, public tying of the private to the political. To accept was to make her life visible in ways she had not chosen by herself. To decline would be to reject a man who had invited her into his most dangerous rooms. Her first thought flew to the cottage, the crooked spoon, and the way the twins' laughter had once filled a small space. Her second thought was of the tutor, who had taught men to account and yet never asked for anything in return. She thought of Master Gervais, a man who balanced ledgers and nights with equal burdens. And she thought of the small rebellions she had performed all her life, keeping someone's satchel under sacks on hard nights, tucking a child extra porridge. She rose before she could be driven by other people's timelines. "Will I have a voice?" she asked plainly, more to herself than to any assembly. The question came out of the very marrow of who she had been all her life. Louis took her hand then, not as a plea, but as an answer. "You will have a voice," he said. "You will speak as you always have. I will be the one forced to listen." Her answer was not a song. It was an arrangement, practical, brave, and so utterly human that the chamber, despite its love of ceremony, could not help but be moved. "Yes," she said, "if you will keep me as I am, and if you will let me say what matters, which means nothing will be perfect and much will have to be mended." He laughed softly, the expression of a man who had waited for this permission longer than he had suspected. The sound, tender, relieved, seemed to loosen something in the room. There were deprecating coughs from some corners, which elicited a faint smile from Elise, as if she recognized that people took their discomfort and dressed it as decorum. So the proposal, quiet and public, sealed a pact that was at once domestic and civic. News spread in the way news does in halls and houses, in whispers, in surprised smiles, in the careful quill of a scribe turning an errand into a record. It did not change the world overnight. It rearranged small things that mattered. For example, when Louis returned to his apartments afterwards, he found on his table not only congratulatory notes, but also a scrap of paper from the tutor, suggesting a list of witnesses for the commission, and the name of a man in the collector's office who might be coaxed into oversight with the right cause. Master Gervais, in his ledger-lined world, responded with the complicated human mixture of duty and family that had marked his earlier visit. He did not become melodramatically contrite. He wrote notes, he made small shifts. They arranged a meeting where he could air his concerns, how to keep coffers balanced, how to deliver bread without causing ruination, while Louis insisted on a small, binding change, Collectors would be required to file appeals from households and to certify under penalty that the case had been considered. The collector, who had been painted a simple antagonist in too many village fireside tales, showed up with a list of cases in which families had willingly overloaded the ledger for reasons he did not like to name: the cough of a child, the cost of a widow's medicine. Master Gervais, in his ledger-lined world, responded with the complicated human mixture of duty and family that had marked his earlier visit. He did not become melodramatically contrite. He wrote notes, he made small shifts. They arranged a meeting where he could air his concerns: how to keep coffers balanced, how to deliver bread without causing ruination, while Louis insisted on a small, binding change. Collectors would be required to file appeals from households and to certify, under penalty, that the case had been considered. The collector, who had been painted a simple antagonist in too many village fireside tales, showed up with a list of cases in which families had willingly overloaded the ledger for reasons he did not like to name: the cough of a child, the cost of a widow's medicine. Master Gervais's ledger did not become a work of mercy overnight, but the small changes were visible in modest ways. A mother in a nearby hamlet received a forgivable delay for a harvest turned sour. A record of confused collections was reviewed and corrected. An error that would have forced a man to sell his plow was amended, allowing him to plant again the following season. The collector himself found that when his records were made public, he could defend his work better. He also learned to soften language in his notices, because words, once in ink, could be read by those who did not know the weight of a day's labor. Elise felt the tug of both worlds. She taught Louis to knot cords for hanging game, and he, in turn, showed her how to read an account so that she could ask the better questions of those who claimed hardship. They opened a small committee that met once a month in the tutor's room, not grand edicts, but a place where people could bring complaints and have them heard. Marius sat in those meetings with the dry patience of a man who knew how to ask the right question, and the council forwarded small items to be tested and measured. At home, the palace staff adjusted as well. The housekeeper, practical, skeptical at first, found in Elise a curious ally. "You have a way with a stubborn pan, Miss Elise," she told her one morning as they scrubbed pots together. "And you have the stomach for telling a lord when he speaks nonsense." Elise replied with the blunt compliment she favored: "And you have a softness you hide with good cooking." There were, of course, resentments. Villagers who believed the presence of a Beaumont in their midst would mean hands outstretched for favors, grumbled about perceived slights. A whispering set of ladies at court decided to test Elise's mettle by offering pointed, though polite, commentary on her stitching. Elise answered not with sharp retorts, but with steady competence: a correct hem, a precise accounting of a child's fever, the kind of small authority that defeats rumor, not with fury, but with the fact of reliability. The river did not forget the cottage easily. When the season turned and frost bit the corners of hedges, Elise returned for a night to the place that had once been everything. She sat on the crooked step and ran her hand along the same wood, feeling the imprint of years. The forest still held the old hush. In some places, the stones had more lichen, and the path had erased itself a little, but the air tasted of the same things: soil, leaf, the faint smoke of distant hearths. She met Madame Fournier at the gate, who had the new habit of being frank without malice. "You wear this life well," Madame Fournier said, eyes narrowing as if trying to define a new weather. "Not as ornament, but as a thing you can live in." Elise looked at her and smiled a careful smile. "I could not have done it without you being who you are when you are not well liked." The old neighbor had a way of conceding small points without giving the whole. It satisfied them both. In the quiet that comes after months of work, Elise sometimes found herself at the nursery window, watching Henri and Claire pursue each other with the kind of fervor children reserve for worlds they own. Louis would appear at her shoulder, his hand finding hers as naturally as a habit. He had gained steadiness without losing the softness that had drawn her in the first place. He still wiped a child's brow as if it mattered more than any decree. One afternoon, some small time after the marriage, a letter arrived for Master Gervais. It was a notice from the council. A review would be made of the methods of collection, and a committee would be formed to oversee practice. The letter meant more work for the collector, and when he read it, his shoulders tightened with the practical strain of a man who had enough on his plate to begin with. He looked up at Louis, then across at Elise, and something like relief softened his features. "You have not made me redundant," he said, voice roughened by years of accounting. "You have made me answerable." "That is all anyone asks of you," Elise said simply. He nodded in a way that carried the weight of a man who had been given not a handout, but the demand to be better. That night, he visited the tutor and spoke of his daughter in a way he had not in the market. He admitted his mistakes, small and human, and began, in the slow way people do who must keep both family and practice afloat, to make amends where he could. The seasons continued their patient moving. Reforms in small measures trickled through the countryside like new shoots finding light in a dense woodland floor. For every corrected ledger, there were 10 untouched hurts. For every family who found temporary relief, there was another who learned, with stubbornness, to make new plans. But for those within reach of the tutor's board, of Elise's quiet determination and Louis's attention, life became a little less brittle. Years later, when the twins could walk and be scolded for climbing the palace curtains, Elise would sometimes sit with her needle and pause, looking at her husband as he spoke in a council chamber. The ring on her hand had the same small light it always had, a loop of gold dimmed by work and brightened by presence. When she rested a palm on Henri's small head while he chattered in a merchant's tongue he had picked up like a bird picking up a new call, she would feel the same solid, bewildering joy she had felt the morning she first found a hand in a sleeve by an oak. She had not known then who the man at her door was. She had only known a person needing shelter and 2 infants needing warmth. That ignorance had been an act of grace she had not planned to extend beyond the moment. But that moment, like a seed, had altered what grew after. In quiet hours, she thought of what they had done, not to remake a state, but to mend the things within their reach. She thought of the tutor's steady hand, of Master Gervais in the cool silence of his office, of Madame Fournier learning to soften her judgments. The palace had not turned into a utopia. It remained a place of habits and need, but it had been touched by small acts of attention that changed how certain doors opened and certain ledgers were read. On a Sunday morning, years from the rush of their first arrival, Elise returned to the cottage with Louis and the twins. The small house stood as it had, crooked and patient, smoke curling from its chimney like a familiar hand in the air. They sat on the step, hands folded in laps grown used to new work, and Louis, who had once worn the weight of a name like armor, took the hand of the woman who had first made his life possible in the half-light beneath an oak. "You did not know," he said, voice low with the old memory, "and yet you gave us a roof." She looked at him then, at the man who had learned to answer ledgers with compassion and to speak in councils with a humility that had cost him pride. "I knew only what I had to do," she answered. "A roof for 2 wailing children and a man who needed to rest. That was all the world asked of me that morning. I had no idea the ring would make us anything more than neighbors." They sat for a time in the sun, children running in the yard, now older, their laughter carrying like a bell, and the tutor's voice could be heard behind them, discussing the next small measure to propose. There was nothing triumphal in the way they sat, only the steady, slow peace of people who had chosen to do what was right when it mattered, and who had not expected miracles. The forest across the valley looked as if nothing had changed at all, and in some ways it had not. In others, everything had been altered by a decision small as bread and large as an oath. Sometimes, when Elise felt the old fear of being not enough, of being only someone's story, Louis would take her hand and press his forehead to her knuckles, grounding her as he had learned to do in the months before he spoke to council. She would remember the first morning she had found a pair of babies asleep against a man's chest, and the way she had thought, simply and absolutely, that they needed a lap. That is how most important things begin, with a small, practical answer to a need. The palace grew accustomed to the presence of a woman who knew about mending as much as policy. The court learned that compassion could be tested and proved by ledger and witness. The collector found his conscience called to account by records and by a man who had once slept on a stranger's shoulder. The tutor kept teaching men to ask better questions. The twins grew into children who knew not only who their father was, but the value of an honest word. Elise often returned to the oak in the wood, alone sometimes, to stand where she had first found a hand and a ring, and to let the memory be a small, quiet thing in her life, no longer the axis upon which her world spun, but a seed from which a slow canopy had grown. If this story has touched you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know which corner of the world held you as you heard it. And if you would like another tale of small mercies and patient courage, subscribe and stay. There are more stories of ordinary people who make a quiet difference, one hearth at a time.